Hello everybody, CVH here, and in today's video we're going to be talking about Return to Clockwork City, the most recent expansion for Elder Scrolls Legends that came out on November 30th, specifically whether or not you should purchase it. I know spending your in-game hard-earned gold, or even your hard-earned money, on your hobby can often be a tricky situation whether or not things are worth it, and it's kind of hard to evaluate, especially if you're a new player coming into a game like Legends that already has a ton of different content you could consider purchasing with money or gold. So hopefully this video can shed some light on my perspective, the value the expansion will give you for the money, and how much of a priority you should place on it if you are a newer player. First, let's talk about the basics. Return to Clockwork City is a story expansion, which means it has player versus AI content. Single-player content broken up into 3 acts over 35 separate missions to play through. All of these missions are also available in the Master difficulty, and completing them all on the Master difficulty will give you an alternate art version of Swims at Night. You can get 55 total new cards. If you get all of the acts and play through all of the story missions, you will unlock the maximum copies of all of those cards simply through playing through everything the expansion has to offer as far as content goes. And like I said, there are 3 different acts. You can purchase them with in-game gold at 1,000 gold apiece or $7.99 in US dollars. You can also buy, of course, all 3 acts for 3,000 gold, or there's a bundle for $19.99 US dollars. I'm not exactly sure what that would be in other currencies, but if you use that particular bundle, you will get an alternate art copy of the unique legendary from Intelligence from the expansion, Loneth. This pricing model seems pretty much in line with what TESL has established as the norm with Fall of the Dark Brotherhood previously, and I think it's what we can expect moving forward if we are to get more story expansions like Fall of the Dark Brotherhood and like Clockwork City in the future. The first thing I'd like to talk about when discussing the relative value of Return to Clockwork City is the single-player content. This is a story expansion after all. It's not simply buying packs and then opening the packs and that's the entire experience. This expansion is giving you 35 separate missions to play through, so if the content is quality, that could add a lot of value to your purchase. And I have to say, the single-player content Direwolf Digital managed to create for Return to Clockwork City is phenomenal. Personally, a lot of you might know this about me, but the single-player content and story modes like that aren't really what draws me to collectible card games, which are at their core a multiplayer experience, usually 1v1s. But even as someone who isn't particularly too interested in single-player content like this, did enjoy the modes that were presented in Return to Clockwork City. I found myself being interested in the gameplay elements of them. Without trying to spoil too much here, they do make you think outside the box, not only in regards to deck building, but also in regard to the gameplay itself. A lot of the rules are broken, and the games don't necessarily operate like traditional games of Elder Scrolls Legends, and I think that's great for this kind of story expansion. I hope they continue breaking the rules of deck building and gameplay in the future single-player content for Legends, because it really makes it feel unique. And of course, if you want to expand on the unique gameplay and the unique puzzles that the story missions present to you, you can of course replay them all in the Master difficulty for more of a challenge, and also the alternate art Swims at Night. So if you're debating whether or not to buy Return to Clockwork City, and one of the main pulls for you is the single-player content, and you're worried about whether or not it will be fun, I have to say you might as well stop the video right here. I strongly encourage you to just get this expansion. I think it's some of the most unique single-player content Legends has seen so far. And of course, if you want a more in-depth, aka spoilerish look at the content itself, many other YouTubers and streamers have done the runs, either on stream or on different YouTube channels already, so check them out. I'm sure you can find all of the story missions if you really want to get them spoiled for you. But of course, that's not where today's review is going to end. As with any expansion, story, pack, or otherwise, Return to Clockwork City's main purpose was to add more cards to the card pool, so we can't really assess the value of the expansion and whether or not you should purchase it without talking about the cards themselves and their playability. Return to Clockwork City does have some of the most interesting card design in Elder Scrolls Legends, and it does give us 2 new mechanics in Treasure Hunt and Assemble, but over the past few weeks since its release, it's come under a lot of fire from a lot of players as being one of the weakest expansions, if not the weakest expansion to date. So in order to assess the truth of that statement, I think we need to really take a critical eye in each of the attributes, including neutral, and really see how many of these cards are impacting the top tier decks. Tier 1, Tier 2, even Tier 3, how many of these cards are really honestly seeing play in what we could call competitive decks? Of the strength cards in Return to Clockwork City, the only two I can say I have see real amounts of play in competitive decks are Aldora the Daring and Grappling Hook. And it's important to note that Grappling Hook doesn't see too much play in top tier decks because it's limited to control warriors, some control archers, decks that don't necessarily see a whole lot of play themselves, but it could be good in them. Aldora the Daring, it's above average in some decks. I wouldn't say it's a staple in any of them, and unfortunately I haven't seen much of the other cards at all outside of Arena. Intelligence is much the same deal. Unfortunately for me, because Intelligence is my favorite attribute, the only card from the bunch that I've seen in top tier decks is Loneth, which has seemed mostly like a staple in decks like Control Mage for me, but obviously wouldn't see play in any aggressive style of deck whatsoever. I've also seen Reverberating Strike here and there in various control decks, Excavate as a one-of in certain support Control Mages, although I would hardly say it's necessary, and besides that again, I haven't seen too many of the others outside of Arena. Willpower gives us one of the most fantastic cards in all of Return to Clockwork City, and that is Phalanx Exemplar, which I have seen in a wide array of different decks that use Willpower. I wouldn't say it's really stuck as a staple in too many of them except for the mid-rangey ones, and it is very powerful in those. Besides that, Clockwork Apostle has made an appearance in certain decks like mid-range Mage and mid-range Spell Sword. Again, I wouldn't call it a staple. I've seen Riften Lawkeeper experimented with a little bit. I've seen the Mechanical Heart experimented with, again, just in that support Control Mage with Excavate. I would hardly call either of those two cards a staple, and I wouldn't call Clockwork Apostle a staple either. I would say Phalanx Exemplar so far is the card that most resembles a staple out of all the ones we've talked about, but I wouldn't worry about too many of the other ones. In Agility, Murkwater Guide has seen a little bit of play not only in Goblins but also in Swindler's Market Archer decks, and Clockwork Scorpion has seen a lot of play in various Rage Archer decks, such as the one I've played recently on the channel, and I've found both of those cards to be pretty powerful in the respective strategies they go in, although I would hardly call them staples for the majority of Agility decks because they do require some level of synergy. Sails Through Storms can also be slotted into a variety of different mid-range decks, although the card is somewhat unreliable due to its effect dealing in RNG somewhat, and also it has to live an entire turn before you can even think about getting the effect, so I wouldn't worry about this card if you don't already have it. I don't think it should be in every single mid-range deck, but it is something you can play. Endurance actually gives us several playable cards, the first of which being Barrow Stalker, which has seen a lot of play in both offensive and defensive decks using Endurance. Some decks like Midrange Sorcerer and Midrange Spell Sword use it to push damage early. Some, like more defensive Spell Swords and Ramp Scouts, could even use it defensively just to stave off early aggression. Galen the Shelter has seen a good amount of play, mostly in Ramp Scout. It's been determined to be the most powerful in control decks because the game goes late and you can duplicate very powerful legendaries like Parthenax that you would otherwise only have one of. Mistveil Warden has seen a little bit of play in certain guard-centric decks, but I don't think it's been too crazy. Hallowed Death Priest has been very hyped. I wouldn't necessarily say this card is too required in any one strategy, but it is a reasonable tech card if you're worried about late-game decks. The neutrals are a little harder to rate because a lot of the power level of the factotums in particular are very dependent on the power level of the deck type in its entirety, and honestly I haven't been too blown away by any factotum deck, although some players have played them to success in gauntlet modes and even on the ladder. That said, I don't think this is an archetype you need to worry too much about picking up, but if you want to experiment with the factotum archetype, it is passable on the ladder to a degree. That said, you would pretty much never play any of the factotums outside of a deck that wants to utilize them specifically. Besides the factotums, on the first page, Reflective Automaton has seen some constructed play outside of the factotum archetype, which it is good in, because it can be slotted into decks like Goblins for an additional 2 cost that has race synergy. It can also be used alongside some of the lookouts if you're trying to play a dragon-oriented deck, and of course this is a card that could get better down the line as more race synergies are printed. Dragon Aspect has seen some play in control decks to supplement the other shout you might be playing. For example, Control Monk can utilize Dragon Aspect alongside Drain Vitality and doesn't really have to worry about Call of Valor too much. Treasure Map has also seen a limited amount of play. It can supplement your items in an item-centric deck. Outside of those decks, I haven't seen Treasure Map too much, but it is a reasonable enough card that could be slotted into a variety of strategies. Clockwork Dragon initially received a lot of hype, and I don't necessarily think it's lived up to that hype, but I would like to shout it out as a decent supplemental 5-cost creature with some level of versatility, and I have seen it in some Tier 1 and Tier 2 decks on the ladder. Again, I wouldn't say Clockwork Dragon has made a name for itself as a staple in any of them. And finally, Mechanar has seen some amount of play in Control Mage and other slow decks like Ramp Scout, although I don't think any of them requires Mechanar to be effective. So having taken a critical look at the cards in Return to Clockwork City, it's clear they weren't necessarily going for the most competitive selection of cards. This is an expansion with a lot of interesting card design, a lot of in-expansion synergies, so if you get the entire expansion, you're immediately able to experiment with the full capabilities of a treasure hunt deck or a factotum assembled deck, and you can even add to existing archetypes like goblins and dragons and all kinds of things like that. So besides the cool single-player content, and the ability it gives you to experiment with a variety of very cool sounding strategies, I wouldn't necessarily put this as the most important expansion for competitive viability. If you're simply building your collection up from scratch and the main concern you have is being competitive on the ladder and in tournaments, I would have to say to give Clockwork City an initial pass. Now, I don't think you should ignore the expansion altogether if your main concern is competitive viability. As I mentioned, I've used several of the cards in the expansion and all of the attributes in my own constructed decks. It just depends on the style of deck you're using, and it also depends on how necessary those cards are. If you're just building your account from scratch and your main concern is doing well on the ladder and in tournaments, I'd have to say to focus on your core set packs and your Heroes of Skyrim packs, as both of those expansions are huge and full of playable cards that have impacted all metas. And also, if you're looking into the story expansions, Fall of the Dark Brotherhood has a way higher density of competitively viable cards, even outside of the cards in Fall of the Dark Brotherhood like Unstoppable Rage, which have sort of had an entire deck built around them because of how good they are. There are a lot of other cards in that expansion that you just don't want to be caught without if you're playing a deck including their attribute. After all that's said and done, I would say Return to Clockwork City is a perfectly fine expansion to get. Whether or not you want to get that before Madhouse Collection kind of just depends on you and what kind of decks you're interested in playing. Madhouse Collection has just a few playable cards, even less than this expansion if we're being honest, but some of them are critical for a few very specific styles of decks. And I talked about Madhouse Collection in a separate video that you guys can watch if you're really interested in that expansion. So as far as story and single player content goes, Return to Clockwork City gets an easy A+ from me. As far as interesting card design that allows the player to experiment with a variety of different strategies that seem interesting and fun, this expansion also gets a solid A for me. As far as competitive viability goes, I would have to say this expansion is around a C, maybe a C+. Either way, hopefully this review helped you out a little bit in your determination of whether or not Return to Clockwork City is right for you. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and stay subscribed for more Legends content. Follow my stream in the description, and I'll see you next time.